Howdy. I was recently talking to an Eastern Orthodox gentleman, and we were talking about the Eucharist. And he said, you Catholics talk about it as the Last Supper, but we prefer to think of it as the First Supper. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, it was, in a sense, the Last Supper of Christ before his death, but it was the First Supper in that it became the pattern for the liturgy of the Eucharist and for the Eucharist from that moment until the very end of time. And I think that can be very helpful to us as we study the Eucharist and looking at the Last Supper as a pattern that's set forth, that echoes throughout time. And Thomas Aquinas, in question 81 of the third part of the Summa, does an examination of the Last Supper in 4 articles. So we're going to dig down deep in each one of those and see what we find. In the first article, in question 81, Christ asks, at that Last Supper in the upper room with the apostles, when Christ instituted the supper of the Lord, when he instituted the Eucharist, did he actually eat and drink his own blood? You remember he said he takes the bread and says, this is my body. He takes the chalice, this is my blood of the new covenant. And then, of course, the apostles receive it. But did Christ himself receive it? And Thomas answers with the tradition of the church, yes. Christ, in fact, with his hands, when the bread and when the wine were transubstantiated into his body and into his blood, he actually consumed himself. And he quotes here, Thomas quotes St. Jerome. Jerome says, the Lord Jesus Christ himself, the guest and banquet, is both the partaker and what is eaten, end quote. And then Thomas quotes a little rhyme. And it's interesting, throughout the Summa, you see Thomas occasionally quoting these little rhymes. They're almost like little catechetical poems that people would learn to help them remember these doctrines in the Middle Ages. Remember, not everybody's literate, so they have these little rhymes or these little songs, jingles, to help them remember the theology. And Thomas quotes it as this. This is translated into English, but the original Latin, it goes something like this. The king at supper sits, the 12 as guest he greets, clasping himself in his hands, the food himself now eats. So again, Christ is there at the Last Supper. He transubstantiates the bread and the wine into his own body and blood, and then he actually himself, as high priest, receives them, just as every priest in all of history receives the body and blood at the Mass. Now, the second question he asks is in Article 2, and he asks, did Christ give the Eucharist to Judas Iscariot? We touched on this in a previous video class on who can and cannot receive communion. And here Thomas deals with it a little more deeply. And he says, in fact, that Judas did receive communion. So Christ knew that he would be betrayed by Judas. He knew that Judas was a sinner. He knew that Judas was no longer serving him. And yet he gave him the communion. And he quotes St. John Chrysostom here, and I'll give you the full quote. Judas was not converted while partaking of the sacred mysteries. Hence, on both sides, his crime becomes the more heinous, both because imbued with such a purpose he approached the mysteries, and because he became none the better for approaching, neither from fear nor from the benefit received, nor from the honor conferred on him. So, again, this goes back also, if you see the video, who can and cannot receive communion, Thomas there makes the distinction between the private sinner, the secret sinner, and the public or notorious sinner. And Thomas says, and it's reaffirmed here, that the secret sinner is admitted to communion. So if the priest knows that someone is an adulterer or murderer, but it's not a public fact, the priest will admit them to communion. But if they are a public sinner, everyone knows that they're an adulterer or murderer, and they come forward for communion, the priest will forbid them, bar them there publicly. That's the teaching of St. Thomas. And Judas Iscariot is kind of the classic case point for this distinction. So again, I'd encourage you to check that out for yourself. It's question 81, Article 2. And now we move on to Article 3, and this is the most obscure one, maybe the most difficult to understand. And Thomas asks this question. What kind of body did he receive or give? Namely, was it passible or impassible? Okay, so what does that mean, passible or impassible? Well, Thomas elsewhere discusses the four attributes or the four characteristics of a glorified, resurrected human body, like how human bodies will be that are redeemed at the end of time. And there are four of them. The first one is subtlety. So this is really kind of the ability to transcend space. So one could pass through a wall. Or as we talked about in the video course on the painless birth of Christ, how Christ could pass miraculously through the womb of Mary. Or after his resurrection, when the apostles are locked in a room, Christ passes into the room, apparently through the walls or through the door when it's locked. In his glorified state, the physical body has properties that are beyond what we know as, normal, natural physicality. The second is agility. And the example Thomas gives here is like, for example, Christ was able to walk on water. I've tried it and I sunk. It doesn't work. But for the glorified body, that body that would be in heaven, there are these new properties. So that's the second one, agility. And the third one is clarity. And this doesn't mean that the body is clear, but that the body has an aura or a glow. And we see that, Thomas says, at the transfiguration when Christ goes on the mountain and he reveals kind of his glory or his power, and there's this light emanating from him. And then the fourth is impassibility. And impassibility means that you're not going to corrupt, you're not going to get sick, of course, all of that, but also you can't be altered or changed. So you're not going to age, your appearance isn't going to change. Impassive is like the in Latin, passio means to change, to suffer, and so on and so forth. So an impassible body would be an unchanging body. It has its kind of its permanence. So Thomas asked, when Christ gave the Eucharist at the Last Supper and the bread and the wine transubstantiate into his body and blood, was that body and blood impassible or passible? We know after Christ rose from the dead that his body was impassible. But what about before? Because this is 3.5 days before the resurrection. And Thomas answers that it is in fact the passible body, because he hasn't resurrected, but it's given in an impassible way. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the substance and accidents in the video class on transubstantiation. But here, if the apostles received the body and chewed on it, it's not going to change the physical complexion or structure of Christ. That's a metaphysical impossibility here. So it is the passible Christ, because he hasn't yet suffered and resurrected, but the mode in which it's given is impassible. And then we get to the fourth article in this question relates to the nature of his soul and his body in the Eucharist. And he asked the question, if, for example, at the Last Supper they had reserved some of the Blessed Sacrament, let's say, and put it in a tabernacle or a box, when Christ died on Good Friday, would death have occurred in the Eucharist, or more specifically, would the soul of Christ been united to the Blessed Sacrament? This is a very complicated metaphysical question. We believe in the sacrament, it's the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ in the Eucharist. So if the Eucharist had been reserved and Christ died from Good Friday to Holy Saturday into the very first moment of Easter before he resurrected, would the soul have been present? And Thomas says, no. In the Eucharist, the soul will not have been there, because the soul, as we say in the Apostles' Creed, descended into hell only to rise again on the third day. So those are the four articles, and what can we learn from these? Some of these are obscure. I think what Thomas is doing here is he's taking us back to the Last Supper, and he's asking some really robust, difficult metaphysical questions, because it helps us more deeply appreciate the mystical doctrine of transubstantiation. For example, how is Christ's real soul related to our reception of communion? What about grave sinners like Judas Iscariot? Does Christ still have mercy on them, and is he willing to extend these graces to them even though they want to betray him? These are all the kind of things that are going on in here. So I want to leave you with a challenge. The next time you're at Mass, the next time you go to church, and you receive Holy Communion, and you have the Holy Communion in your mouth, think about these deep mysteries and say, God is in my mouth. I mean, just think about almost how insane that is, how the world would hear that and say, that doesn't make any sense, right? And yet that is what we believe, and that is what is revealed at that Last Supper, or we might call the First Supper. So thanks so much, and please, if you haven't already, take time to see the other video classes on the Eucharistic theology of Thomas Aquinas. It's some of his best work, and I think you'll really grow in your faith for it. Hey, thanks for watching. God bless.